Good afternoon, everyone. This is Shirley Ginwright. I'm the chair of the Fairfax County Communities of Trust Committee. Thank you for joining us on our third educational webinar. And today we will be discussing the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act and racial injustices. I would like to introduce you to our moderator, Cantor Michael Shochet from the Temple Rodolph Shalom and a synagogue in Falls Church, Virginia. Michael is also the senior cantor there, and he is the chaplain in Fairfax County Police Department. He has worked in Baltimore Police Department and has been a police officer for 21 years. So I would like to introduce you to our moderator and turn it over to Cantor Michael Shochet.
Thank you, Shirley. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. Thanks for being part of this panel discussion and this forum about such an important topic. We're honored to have three wonderful, incredible panelists with us. Senator Warner, who I'll introduce in a moment, Dr. Brenda Hale from Roanoke, NAACP, and Shirley Ginwright from the Communities of Trust. As Shirley mentioned, I am the current chaplain coordinator of our Fairfax County Police Department and one of the clergy at Temple Road of Shalom. I was a police officer many years ago in Baltimore City, involved in a shooting, and then ended up going into the Cantorate, where I have been now for the last 26 years. But as a former law enforcement officer and very involved with law enforcement, it's a very important opportunity for me to be here with you to help talk about this change in policing in our country that we're about to see. The goal of this discussion is to shed light and learn more about this George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that was passed by the House of Representatives in June and is now in the Senate. And so I want to first turn it over to Senator Warner, who it's an honor to be with you, Senator. You were elected to the Senate in November of 2008, and in your second term now, you serve on the Senate Finance, Banking, Budget, and Rules Committees, as well as Vice Chair of the Select Committee on Intelligence. And prior to that, as we all know, you were Governor of Virginia from 2002 to 2006. So thank you for being with us, Senator Warner, and I would love for you to talk a little bit and explain about the bill that's currently in the Senate.
Well, Michael, thank you for that introduction, and Shirley, thank you for the Communities of Trust playing this important role as chair of this organization. I want to commend all the folks in Fairfax County who I think were forward-leaning enough to put together this kind of group. I've also had the opportunity to work with Brenda Hale for well over 20 years, long before I was governor of the Commonwealth, and I look forward to this conversation. Like I think the vast majority of Americans, the shocking murder of George Floyd, coming on the heels of murders of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, I think woke up a number of Americans about the challenges we have with our criminal justice system. I think back about the fact that this is not a new problem, as I think we all know. My very first law that I helped get passed when I was governor was passed by then Delegate Ken Melvin, who's now a judge down in Portsmouth, but it was a bill to try to end racial profiling and put some level of greater racial sensitivity training for our state police. And that was back in 2002. And here we are in 2020. And this issue of systemic racism, and unfortunately how that plays out too often in our criminal justice system, is still as raw and as powerful and as needed as reform as ever. And while the some of the immediate passion of those first days has passed, I want to just say at the outset that I am committed, as long as I'm in the Senate, to continue to pursue the legislation that has passed the House, the Justice and Policing Act, of which I am one of the original co-sponsors. That legislation on the Senate side was originally put together by Cory Booker and Kamala Harris, and I was proud to join with 44 Senate Democrats to be original co-sponsors of that legislation. Let me very briefly, because I know we're going to have a good chance to have a full discussion, go through a number of the items in the legislation. The bill will finally start to hold those police officers who have a history of misconduct accountable. It will dramatically reform things like qualified immunity. Legislation will end no-knock warrants, where we saw that take place in Louisville with Breonna Taylor, leading to her demise. It will get rid of chokeholds, which was so infamously seen on the murder of George Floyd, close to 8 minutes and 46 seconds that interaction took place. It would actually create a national police misconduct registry, so we could stop the practice that still takes place too often, where a law enforcement officer may be found out to have misconduct, maybe even leaves that department, but then simply goes 50 miles down the road and gets rehired by a new police department. By creating this national registry, we can prevent that kind of bad apple jumping around from one department to another. It will also mandate racial bias training. And training is not going to be an answer in and of itself, but it is a critical component. And that training, I believe, needs to be not simply a one-time, one-off effort, but it needs to be ongoing, and people need to have those refresher courses along the way. It will limit a program called 1033, where we've seen, unfortunately, over the last 15 years at least, particularly post-Iraq and Afghanistan wars, where we've seen surplus military equipment be oftentimes sold or given to our police departments, and police departments now appearing, in many cases, with weapons of war rather than weapons of peace, or the ability to kind of keep appropriate crowd control may or may not be best utilized with some of this military equipment that has been too often ends up on our nation's streets. It will encourage the use of body cameras, something that we constantly see as a way to have a level of accountability that just doesn't happen. Again, an area that we saw recently 3 years ago on a case that I'm still following, Bijan Gazar, where Park Police chased a young man. The young man had been a victim of a hit and run accident. Park Police pulled him over a couple of times, and then finally on the third time shot Mr. Bijan, and his family has asked for some level of justice for the last 3 years. We wouldn't have that evidence of what happened if there wasn't Fairfax County Police that were trailing behind and recording that incident. We'll also finally, in this legislation, make lynching a federal crime. Lynching is, it is remarkable in this country that still has not become a federal crime. And I believe that this bill will also lead to a series of practices to improve efficiency in investigations into misconduct. No single piece of legislation is going to solve every problem. I hope that during our conversation we can talk about training standards in our country versus training standards around the rest of the world where we don't have this level of violence. But I do believe the Justice and Policing Act, which, as Michael has said, has already passed the House of Representatives, is our best opportunity to bring meaningful reform to our criminal justice system, and finally take a giant step towards making sure that all Americans, no matter what we look like, what our racial or religious or ethnic heritage would be, can view the police officers as folks that will actually serve and protect. For too many Americans, particularly Black Americans, police officers disproportionately are viewed fearfully rather than viewed as people that will actually protect the community. I think the Justice and Policing Act will go a long way towards remedying that. And I also just want to say one of the things that gives me so much hope is in the aftermath of George Floyd, when and in the countless protests that we saw around the country, the number of police officers and police chiefs who joined the protesters and said, this is a time now for us to reform our criminal justice system. So I hold great hope that this piece of legislation can become law. I'm disappointed that we haven't had a chance to vote on it yet in the Senate, but I know our day will come. So I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Senator. It truly sounds like a sweeping police reform legislation, and anxious to talk more about it and hear some comments and some questions. With that being said, if anyone listening would like to write a question in the Q&A, please do so. And after we hear from our panelists, our other two panelists will get a chance to start asking some of those questions to any of the panelists. And so I want to turn to welcome Dr. Brenda Hale, who is serving her 8th term as president of the Roanoke branch of the NAACP, and brings with her an impressive portfolio of service, achievement, innovation, and collaboration. She is well respected throughout the region for her community service and her commitment to community and justice as an agent for change. She retired from the U.S. Army in 1978 and has since worked as a nurse treating veterans, as well as in the financial world as a financial advisor. She's been awarded a doctorate in theology as well as a PhD from Roanoke College. She spent her life serving the community in our country and has been awarded for this commitment to making our world a better place. So, Dr. Hale, I bring greetings to you, and I would like to welcome your comments and your thoughts about this legislation that Senator Warner just talked about.
Okay, thank you so very much. And Senator Warner, we really appreciate all that you're doing in the Senate, because you are a tireless, fierce worker. And thank you for being a part of this great reform. We appreciate that. We really do. I do have a couple of concerns though. And I am thankful that I am still living as a 75-year-old lady to witness this change that has taken so long to come about. You know, the NAACP was formed in 1909, and it was formed because of the terrible amount of lynchings that were taking place throughout the country. And now, all of these generations later, we're finally gonna get that reform, that lynching is a serious malady that African Americans have suffered so very, very long. There's a term in the act that says limits qualified immunity as a defense to liability in a private civil action. When you say limit, I get very concerned about that, because we have to hold all of these police officers accountable for their malfeasance. And I just think that we need some teeth in the legislation that can make this come about. There is another thing that I'm concerned about, is the authority. So much authority is given to the Attorney General in the states. And we know that Attorney Generals are elected positions. And we know that some Attorney Generals have extreme bias toward minorities. Not so much here in the Roanoke Valley, but maybe throughout the state of Virginia and beyond. So with this bias, there may be a holding up of legislation or acts that are criminal acts that police officers have done. They could hold up the system in order for justice to be served. This is what I'm trying to say in regards to that. Another thing, one more thing I'm concerned about is the funding. We know that there's tremendous funding up front. Well, I could use an analogy. There was tremendous funding up front for the choice program for Veterans Affairs. And we know what happened, that all of these bills were coming in and the money dried up. So I saw in the legislation here that you have great funding starting the program, but what happens in the year 2023? And most of the time, when you start a new form, when you start a new legislation, when you start a new act, you have great funding at the beginning, but then the funding will decrease with different legislators and different elected officials that come in. Those are just a few of the things I'm concerned about. And I would appreciate you addressing them, and I know that you can. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank
Hale.
you.
Senator Warner, I wonder if you'll hold for a moment and let
Sure.
me introduce Shirley Ginwright, and then you might want to respond to her and Dr. Hale's questions. So Shirley, as you heard, is chair of the Fairfax County Communities of Trust Committee. She's worked in civil rights all her life, marching with the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. She remains an activist defending, protecting, and fighting against injustices for everyone. She retired from the federal government and now spends a majority of her time in her civil rights work, volunteering with various organizations. She has been a two-term president for the Fairfax County NAACP and does a lot of work with the Fairfax County Police Department in diversity and equity, as well as serving with he was just recently appointed by Governor Northam to the Commonwealth African American Advisory Board. So Shirley, I want to welcome you and get your take on the bill, and then we'll ask Senator Warner to respond to some of those questions.
Okay, thank you. What I forgot to mention too is that Michael has been a member of the Communities of Trust Committee since its inception almost 6 years ago. So thank you, Michael, for sticking with us for this long. Senator Warner, thank you for co-sponsoring this bill over in the Senate. I look at it and I see some changes that should have been done a long time ago. But at least we're headed in the right direction on a national level, not just the states taking a handle by themselves. One of the things that the Virginia Legislative Black Caucus recommended, as well as the African American Advisory Board to Governor Northam, is that we have a database that will actually track the discipline of police officers, just as you mentioned, Senator, where they will not be able to go from one jurisdiction to another and be hired. And one of the things that I like the fact that there is an accountability in that funds will be reduced for non-reporting of data to the Attorney General. That's very important because I've seen so often and heard that we can't get information because police officers or police departments don't have a requirement to report, so they don't. So I appreciate that being put in at a national level because this reform has to be done nationally. So thank you very much for that. I think as a big change to where we want to be. In Fairfax County, as Michael said, I've been working with the Law Enforcement and Public Safety Agency for 6 years. So we recently, and as a part of our Community of Trust, reviewed our policy on use of force. And the reasonable, I saw that in the act, has been changed to necessary. And that was one of the comments that had come back from one of our reviewers of the policy. So again, I want to thank you for introducing that over on the Senate side and being supportive. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you both. And Shirley, let me first of all say thank you for 6 years of work on Communities of Trust and the fact that Fairfax County started this effort after Ferguson and built this kind of community involvement with law enforcement, I think is a tribute to the Fairfax County leadership. And Dr. Hale always has strong questions and positions. And let me try to address a number of these. On qualified immunity, I mean, this is, and let me say at the outset that I am Well, I went to law school. I never practiced law. So on some of these items, I am not an expert, and I've relied more on advice of people like Kamala Harris, who was the lead. She and Cory Booker were the two lead authors of the bill in the Senate. And obviously, Kamala Harris was somebody who'd been a local prosecutor, had been also Attorney General of California for 8 years. And my understanding on qualified immunity was that it is a Supreme Court doctrine that basically has allowed, if you had any even minor factual discrepancy between what the victim may say and the law enforcement officer, in a sense, everything goes to the law enforcement officer. And if the law enforcement officer simply says, all right, what I thought I was doing was lawful, that would then mean qualified immunity would kick in. And consequently, law enforcement officers, in a sense, got to set their own set of rules. This does not, you're right, it does not get rid of qualified immunity. I do believe it scales it back in a way that is going to provide a fairer balance. I mean, there does need to, a law enforcement officer, anyone who's got any public official, needs some rights as well when there's a dispute, especially when there's a dispute that may involve a firearm. So I can't say if there is a more perfect way on qualified immunity to get there, but my sense is from both from the advocates who wrote the legislation and honestly also some law enforcement officials who've reviewed this, is they feel that this sets that new balance. It doesn't make all of the presumptions towards the law enforcement officer. It evens the playing field a little bit. I do think, as you said, there's a lot of deferral to both the U.S. attorney in the bill and somewhat to prosecuting attorneys at a local level. And I think one of the things that can be helped is, as communities like Fairfax County has done, set up citizen advisory panels and others to make sure that if a Commonwealth attorney is not doing his or her job, or is ignoring some of the abuses that would be taking place, that he or she would be, that would be exposed, because there would be that citizen advisory group that's playing that kind of watchdog role. And I really do think there's nothing that will fix this problem like more sunshine, more transparency. And I think they really have tried to set that goal around transparency and then use of these citizen advisory panels. And then I think, as Dr. Hale indicated, it is a little bit classic here. This is somebody who reads your legislation carefully when she points out that there's funding on the front end, but there's no guarantee over the long haul. That, Brenda, as you know, is always a challenge. I mean, to get multi-year funding on any federal program, in many ways it is, some people say, and I'm not going to say whether they're right or not, that there might be three parties in Washington: Republicans, Democrats, and appropriators. And the people who often serve on the Appropriations Committee do not like to commit to multi-year funding, because that cuts back on their power. So that power of the purse, which unfortunately it feels like Mr. Trump has been trying to ignore this weekend, at least, with arbitrarily making some decisions that I think raise constitutional issues. But I do think that power of the purse, the appropriators guard fairly carefully. I do think to make this, if we make this Justice and Policing Act the law, it's going to need to be continued to be funded, because one of the things that I've learned is that in many ways, our police officers, we're not fair to them to send them with a firearm to a mental health circumstance, or send them with a firearm only to a marital dispute. We may not have the right people responding. And when we look around the rest of the world, I look at the fact that in America last year, I believe 1,024 people were killed at the hands of police. And in England, UK, which is about a sixth of our size, I think there were 4 or 5 people. So part of that, as I've learned at least, is that in many other countries, in Japan, I think it was 0 people were killed at the hands of the police. Now, we have more firearms on our streets, but also in so many of these other countries, the time it takes to become a law enforcement officer is oftentimes close to 4 years. In America, you can sometimes get through a police academy basic training in 10 weeks. And you can't have that mental health training, that ability to maybe think about de-escalation, if you have that if we don't treat law enforcement officers like the professionals they should be. And that means you've got to have the training to kind of get them that level of skills. So if this becomes a law, I will fight with you, both at the federal level, and a lot of this still funding will ultimately come in terms of the training at the local level as well. And as Shirley has mentioned, this isn't going to get everything, but I really think what we're seeing in this legislation is far and away the most comprehensive criminal justice reform in our lifetimes. And you mentioned the fact around lynchings, for example. I mean, it's an embarrassment that in 2020, lynching is not a federal crime. It is almost, and there was a chance to have this passed unanimously on the lynching component a few weeks ago in the Senate, and one senator held it up. But I do think we need to acknowledge that it may not be perfect, but this moment has come, and for us not to try to push forward on this piece of legislation, and then it can become law, we can find ways to improve it down the line, but we really need to make sure we get this bill to the floor and get it passed.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. So speaking of trying to get it to the floor, what is your feeling about when that will happen, and is there something that is holding that up?
Well, there was a piece of legislation that Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina put forward. And, I have a great deal of respect for Tim Scott. He and I have worked on literally dozens of pieces of legislation that came together. But his piece of legislation was so narrowly drawn and was mostly seemed to be more driven towards like more studies but not the kind of action that the Justice and Policing Act put up. And I think there was a fear that since there was very little support out of the administration and the White House for meaningful change, that something like this could have gone through the Senate, and we would have never had a chance to vote on our legislation. So we did not, in the procedural process, vote to advance his legislation. And I believe what Senator McConnell should have done, the majority leader, he has the votes in the Senate, bring up the Justice and Policing Act that passed the House. He can always amend it. He's got 53 votes. He's got enough votes to amend it, but he chose not to do that. And at this point, we're at a bit of loggerheads on how we can get the Justice and Policing Act to the floor before the election. But we're still trying to talk. And I know I've talked to a lot of my Republican colleagues about this. I think if he would bring the Justice and Policing Act, again, as I said, he could continue to amend it to get it closer to Senator Scott's bill. But we were afraid that if he brought up Senator Scott's bill, this gets into procedure, but so restrict the ability to have any amendments that we'd never get a fair shot at trying to have these policies, while maybe not as strong everywhere as Dr. Hale wants, but still good, solid policies. We'd never even get a vote on them. So we're at this loggerhead point at this point, Mike.
So let's get to some questions that some of the people have written in, and one has to do with transparency efforts, specifically in Fairfax County. What support do you believe that local police transparency efforts has in this Justice and Policing Act? In other words, does it address those issues?
Well, what this legislation puts is it gives you a federal national framework. How it's actually implemented in many cases will then be further left to state law and to local policy. But when you're talking about, improving the efficiencies of investigations into misconduct, when you're talking about doing away with the or cutting back on qualified immunity, when you're talking about encouraging and making sure that there's body cameras. As Shirley mentioned, one of the things that's so important, if you say, okay, if a police department doesn't report this information, they're going to get cut funding. That is going to bring about, that is going to have as much incentive on transparency as anything. If there's a penalty for not being transparent, you guys both, Michael, you and Shirley, would probably have better current knowledge on how the actions that you guys I know have been working on for some time in terms of Fairfax County specific transparency. But I think this really, you know, for example, simply saying that there's going to be standards that say deadly force can only be used as a last resort. You'll then have to build policies around that. But that will all, again, lead towards, I think, the kind of greater transparency that that will allow, particularly people of color in this country, to feel that the law enforcement's on their side.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions that was asked is about one of the provisions about preventing chokeholds and those types of things. Does the restriction apply when a police officer believes that the chokehold is necessary to prevent death or serious bodily injury?
You know, rather than trying to misspeak, that's an important question. I know there is, you know, the legislation is banning chokeholds, but if the police officer feels it's protecting his or her life, I think they are still prohibited. But can I take that for the record and get back to the group with an answer on something as important as that? I don't want to misspeak because I don't know the specific answer.
Sure.
Michael, if
yes.
I can just say, in Fairfax County, it's a part of our use of force policies that it is banned in Fairfax. You know, so I think included in the policies of the local jurisdiction, it should be a requirement. From my reading of the act, it seems that it is banned would be banned around the country. So I don't see where that would be a reasonable or necessary act to prevent somebody by cutting off their air, where it automatically takes away their life.
Sure.
So my interpretation of the act is that it would be banned nationally.
That's my understanding as well. I just didn't know whether there was a, you know, if the police officer feels the specific that what Michael asked, I want to make sure I'm answering specific. But the way I read it too is that this was a ban.
Yeah.
And I think it should be a ban, period.
Let's talk a little bit about the mental health issues, because I know that's something that has come up in a lot of conversation when we're talking about defunding police officers or moving funding around and putting different funding into the mental health response. So when I was a police officer, a senator in Baltimore, I was involved in an incident where someone who was having a mental health breakdown ultimately shot at police and shot my partner, which was one of the reasons that I ended up leaving the police department and from the trauma of that incident. There are clearly many cases where police officers respond to incidents around the country where where they're threatened or people are threatened because of someone having a mental health crisis. And in those cases, having someone who would be from a mental health profession responding instead of someone protecting public safety may be not warranted in a case like that. What's your take on the whole mental health situation in policing?
Well, I think there needs to be more mental health professionals either partnering with police or occasionally, you know, potentially might be the right respondent. I think we sometimes have this default, and I don't think this is fair to our police officers, that the first response is always a police officer. But the challenge becomes, as you pointed out in your own life, if the person who's having a mental health breakdown or challenge has got a weapon, you know, the idea that you're simply going to send a mental health professional there alone to that response, you know, potentially puts that mental health professional at risk. So I've been reading about some communities that are practicing having more mental health professionals, in a sense, almost kind of partner or be right along. So you've got one officer with lethal force, and you've got a mental health professional that would accompany. I go back to the question of, are there lessons we can learn from other countries where that mental health training, that de-escalation training is much more part of the curriculum. And if you take, my understanding, it takes 4 years to be any kind of law enforcement officer in Norway. Well, if you got 4 years, you probably have got that mental health training built in for all law enforcement officers, I understand, in certain countries. Now, whether that works again in America, I'm not sure, but I do think I start with the premise that, to be fair to the community that's being served, and also to be fair to our law enforcement officers, we desperately need a lot of more mental health training and a lot more mental health professionals as part of the response team. Because I think if you don't have that training, I mean, I think probably all of us have seen in our families circumstances where a family member, I know I've seen circumstances where a family member has having mental health issues. And quite honestly, I'm not prepared, I'm not trained or prepared to know how to grapple with that. I could imagine if you're a young officer just fresh out of the academy, that could be a terrifying incident as well. So I think this is areas where we're going to have to, this whole notion of restoring trust, we're going to have to kind of work along with the community and law enforcement to kind of get this right. And it goes back to Brenda's point, and this is going to cost money. And in certain cases, this may require additional resources.
And can I chime in?
Please, Dr. Hale.
Okay. What I want to do is give you a textbook example. And this is involving deadly force, which is something that we've always been talking about. That should not be your first choice. In Richmond, Virginia, there was a 24-year-old teacher who had a mental breakdown. He was without any clothes on him, no weapons in his hands, absolutely nothing. And see, if training had been done with this police officer that responded, that young man would not be laying dead because deadly force was used. So it speaks to deadly force should never be your first option. And if you have the proper training, you know how to de-escalate things, and you know how to call for extra help and spot someone that is having a total mental breakdown. And looking at a man with no clothes, that should have been your first thought. Mm-hmm. That this guy, something is mentally wrong with this gentleman, and you should not want to have seen him dead from this mental breakdown. So it involves a lot of training. And I will always have a fear that officers will respond with deadly force first. And they have no right to be the judge, the jury, and the executioner. So I cannot thank you enough, Senator Warner, for you and all of the ones that had a part in bringing this bill to light and trying to get it fully authorized and fully established as federal law, because it starts at the federal level, come down to the state level, and then to the local level. And everyone benefits from that. And that's how we can have equitable rights for all citizens.
Yes, ma'am.
Senator Warner, I know that you're going to have to leave the call in just a few minutes, so I want to give you a time to say a couple last words, but I wonder if you can address this in your final summation, which is, there have been calls for greater police accountability for decades, if not longer. Protests after Rodney King, for example, or in more recent days, the Eric Garner killing, and many others have spurned protests, but then there's been not this kind of response that we are seeing now. Do you think this is different? Will it take hold? And what are your thoughts as? And we'll stay on, Shirley and Brenda, if you'll stay on with me to continue the discussion. But I want to give Senator Warner the time to summarize.
Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you for that question. And thanks this organization, Shirley, again, for 6 years. The fact that in Fairfax County, you've been building this and the whole notion of communities of trust is why I feel like it is different. I have, and what makes me say that is this kind of legislation, Justice and Policing Act, 44 senators sponsored, the fact that it already has passed the House, that's never happened in the past. I mean, we did 2 years ago, a very small step called the First Step Act that the administration actually supported. And I want to give them appropriate credit for that, but it was at most an incremental move. This Justice and Policing Act is a bold move. It has passed the House of Representatives. It has, I think, if it got to the floor of the Senate, it would even pass the Senate, even with the current Senate, if it was actually voted up or down. And I think there are so many people, young people of all backgrounds, who are saying, who are saying what Black Americans have known for decades, that the policing system in this country today is just not fair enough and does not treat all of us equally. So we've got to take advantage of this moment. We didn't get to other issues today. Bail reform, something that we also need to move forward on. I think, again, we need a lot more conversation about mental health and about extended training for police officers. And that means, I think in many cases, that means police officers who get that additional training ought to get additional pay. I mean, I think there's ways we can work with law enforcement to give it the stature, and also, but that respect has to be earned from the community. And I think this legislation, at least what I hope and pray, is that it's this time it is going to be different, and that we've got a strong enough framework right now that has already passed the House, that if we can make the Justice and Policing Act law of the land, that level of trust that Brenda said that she's not sure a law enforcement officer is never going to resort to lethal force first. I think we can start making that change. It's not going to happen overnight, but she's 75 years young and she has fought these battles for many, many years. Wouldn't it be great if the next generation that came along felt like they'd fought half their life, but they suddenly saw in 2020 real meaningful change come about? And that's what it feels like to me. And in this country, we never fully get there. But at least in this country, I think when we're at our best, we keep striving, we keep trying. And this time it really does feel different. And that's what I hope.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Senator.
And
Thank you.
we'll continue our discussion for, we have another 15 minutes, Shirley and Brenda. I want to get a sense, Brenda, from you, if I can, of what do you think the NAACP reaction is to this type of legislation? Is it robust enough? Do you think it'll make a difference?
I think this is a great start. This is a beginning. Having this legislation in place gives you some teeth in order how to handle cases and how to advocate for citizens that have been unjustly targeted, because profiling is still a reality. People are profiled every day in every city, and there are too many African Americans dying by police execution. So this is a beginning. This is a great start, and I just cannot wait for them to finally pass this legislation so we can just rally in our communities and tell people we have something that we can hang on to, something that we can refer to, something that we can go to that gives us an equitable right, the rights that we should have all along. So yes, I like this legislation, and I have great hope that it's going to bring about some changes that have been desperately needed.
I love your positivity about it. It's so great to hear that, and I hope you are right. I do hope that we get to a place where people feel like they are not being biased against from police officers.
Yeah. So Michael, if I can add on to that,
Yeah.
please. I don't think we need to wait until this act is passed in Senate, because our police jurisdictions can make the changes now. They can make those changes with their policies.
Yes.
This is a great guideline, so they can look at it and say, hey, look, this is what they're going to require us to do, so why not be proactive and start doing it? Since the protests and the riots when Black Lives Matter, I have already seen some police departments that are banning chokeholds. So there is a change. So I don't think we need to wait until the act is finally passed to be proactive and make these changes now.
Absolutely. And, you know, here in Fairfax County, we're doing a lot along those lines to relook at our policies. The state legislature is coming up with some legislation as well. So I'm sure there's going to be lots of changes in local police departments. Let me ask you, though, Shirley, about what do we think this is going to do for the morale of the law enforcement officers themselves? You and I work with a lot of law enforcement officers, and I know there's some things in this legislation, like the qualified immunity, that everyone is fearful of. What's your take, and what do you hear from officers about their reactions?
Well, like you said, some of them are afraid that it's going to prevent the recruitment process for some officers, and that we just aren't going to be able to recruit as many police officers because they are afraid that they can get sued if they, say for instance, they reacted too quick. And as a result, they're going to be penalized, they're going to lose their homes, they're going to be sued. So there is a lot of fear there on how this is going to be implemented and rolled out. I think there's going to need to be a lot of more discussions about it, how it's going to be implemented in each state and in each jurisdiction. But however it's done, I think it should be done the same around the country.
Right.
Because we have too many policies that are different. You know, even in our sentencing is different. That's a whole that's a new forum altogether. But it has to be consistency.
Yeah, and it's true, because if every police department has its own set of guidelines, which is the way it works now, I mean, there are best practices out there, right? And police departments that are accredited by have come under certain national standards, such as Fairfax County, but not every department does that, right? They do their own thing.
Right. And sometimes I think, and having worked with the police for the past 6 years, one of the things that I've seen is we actually have input from the community, and when we're revising the policies and procedures. I think with the immunity, we need to talk to some of our police officers. They are still part of our community, you know. So we have to have input from everybody, and not put everybody put them on the side.
Absolutely. Brenda, can I ask you about? Are you familiar with the crisis intervention team training that happens with law enforcement officers? I don't know if they have that down in Roanoke.
We have a citizens board here in Roanoke, and I have been desperately trying to get a citizen board established in Roanoke County, and I desperately need to be a part of that because of what I could bring to the table. So citizen boards are great, and in this legislation, they're giving them some authority to subpoena. And if you have subpoena authority, then you can get to the truth in a more equitable fashion. So yes, citizen boards should be in every city that has a police department. You should have a citizen board, and that citizen board should reflect the demographics of the city. So if we're here in Roanoke with 105 nationalities, then our citizen board should reflect that, in other words. But in Roanoke County, you have no reflection of anything because you don't even have a citizen board. And you do need the input from minorities, you really do.
Yeah.
And that's how you can go about changing things. You can't change anything if you're still in the dark and not knowing people and how they react. You can't change anything. That's just like with our pandemic that we're in right now. We have to get enough people to change their behavior. That means wear a mask. You're wearing a mask to protect other people and protect yourself and your family. So see, it applies the same way with a police department. And then we have neighborhood police in here, which is excellent because the children will flock to a police officer on a bicycle that will take a minute to stop and talk to them. You see, those little things, if you have enough little things, then the big issues can be overcome because you're trying to make that change and make that difference.
Well, that's so true. The citizen boards you were talking about allow two things. One, citizens to feel like they have somewhere else to turn to if they have a complaint, right? And they know that perhaps it is hopefully an independent board that from the police department that can investigate things if they're unsure that the police department is giving them an equitable investigation. The other thing that you talked about was the relationship building that happens, like in the communities of trust. We're all about building relationships between the community and law enforcement so that law enforcement officers can build that trust right on the street, right? We're in the communities that they serve, which is what community policing is all about.
That's right.
I remember one story about some officers in the district that I serve where they were answering a call for service and there were some kids playing football, and after the officer finished the call, he went and got in the game. And I was thinking to myself, if that would have been me in Baltimore City, I would have been suspended or something for that because we weren't allowed to do that. But here, their supervisors of these officers were very supportive of it because it does build trust and it allows officers to inspire the next generation of people and to because we need to raise up good police officers.
Mhm.
Do that.
Yeah.
But I was also speaking about the CIT program, Crisis Intervention Training, which is mental health training that law enforcement officers get. Here in Fairfax County, all of our officers go through that to help them when they're de-escalating situations with citizens of the county, residents of the county. Do you know in Roanoke if your officers there have crisis intervention training?
I can't speak to that now, but that's something I could follow up with Chief Roman. And if that is not in place, then we sure enough can seek to put that in place. But I could not give an accurate answer on that question right now.
Okay, great.
Yeah. One of the questions too, Mike, with when they were talking about defunding the police, and actually it's not defunding but reallocating funds for mental health and for the criminal when there is an incident and the police is called for a person who's going through mental illness crisis. So one of the things that we're trying to do and recommended from the African American Advisory Board is that we get more counselors, but there is actually a shortage in mental health counselors around the country. So where do we get this training from? And I remember we had the discussion about the fact that if we gave a police officer 80 hours of training in mental health, that still isn't enough. You know, so if you're defunding or reallocating funds so we can get the mental health individuals involved, we still have a shortage. So I think as a nation, we need to start looking at, just as we're trying to hire more police officers to have a diverse force, we need to start looking at how do we increase the mental health profession.
Absolutely. That's a
Yes.
really important point.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, I think we're coming up to 5 o'clock, so I want to say thank you to Dr. Hale, to Shirley Ginwright for being a part of this. Of course, to Senator Warner's staff who helped us make this happen, and Captain Freed from our police department who is working behind the scenes with us, answering some of the questions that have come online. Thank you, Captain Freed. And our Communities of Trust, which meets every month, has a number of forums that we do in the community to help build information, understanding, and trust and relationships. And one of the things we're doing next is on August 24th at 7 p.m. We're having a forum to talk about school resource officers. There's been a lot of discussion about whether having officers in schools is necessary or not, and so this forum will tackle that issue. So Shirley, thank you for all that you do to help bring these issues to light so we can discuss them and try and build information sharing. And I just want to say, and I'll also give you a chance, the two of you, to make some final remarks at the end, but just want to thank all of our law enforcement, public safety people for all that they do all the time, because it is not an easy job, and there are so many good police. There's more good police officers than there are bad police officers. And so we need to continue to support those officers that are out there to make the world better, to bring fairness and equity to their communities. So thank you to all of them. So Brenda, any last comments?
Yes, sir. I want to thank my friend, Shirley Ginwright, for calling me. And she said, would you help me? Sure. What is it that you need? And I just so appreciate that. And she is a wonderful woman, and she touches so many people's lives in such a positive way. And I thank you for being an excellent moderator. I'm going to recommend you do the political debates. Yes, indeed.
It's too much stress. It's too much stress, Brenda.
But, and Brenda, whether you know it or not, Michael was in television for one while.
Yeah.
So.
Yes. I picked that up. He did a great job today, and we thank Senator Warner and his staff, and we thank Bob for being there. And I think that we are making a difference, and with people listening, that we could help educate them about this legislation and about other interventions and things like that. So it was great being with y'all, and let's not make this the last time that we do something together.
Absolutely.
Yes,
I look forward to meeting you in person, Brenda. And Shirley, why don't you have the last word?
Yes. Well, again, I would like to thank Senator Warner and his staff, especially Bo, for communicating with us and helping us get the senator on this forum with us. We appreciate it very much, Bo. Thank you. Brenda Hale, thank you, my friend, for always being there to support me. I appreciate it. And you know I'm available whenever you need me. And Michael, you know you're my right hand. At least one of them. I have a lot of right hands, but you're definitely one of them. And I thank you very much. For all of those who attended and took the time to join in on this forum, thank you so much. And I hope you'll join us in the very next one. So thank you. And thank you again to all of our public safety agencies and our police officers, our citizens. We're doing a lot. So think of something that you can do, like buy someone a cup of coffee or just a hello. It means a lot. And that's one way of starting to build the relationships in your communities with all the public safety agencies, not just with the police department, but the sheriff department, the fire department, the state patrol. these are individuals and they chose this profession just as you may have chose to become a lawyer or a doctor or whatever your profession is. So again, thank you, Michael and Dr. Hale. Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks so much, everybody.